You could make a strong case that he's the most powerful judge in the entire country. And yet, after nearly 2 decades on the bench, Chief Justice John Roberts is still a complete enigma. So is he a neutral umpire, just calling the game as he sees it? Or is he a deeply partisan player, pushing a conservative agenda from the inside? Well, today, we're going to unpack the competing portraits of the man at the very center of the Supreme Court. This right here, this is the image John Roberts wanted the world to see from day one. Back in his 2005 confirmation hearing, he sold himself as a simple umpire, a neutral arbiter whose only job was to call balls and strikes. It was this really powerful metaphor that promised a court guided by law, not by politics. And that promise, well, it's defined his entire career. But now, all these years later, if you ask whether he's actually lived up to that promise, the answer gets, well, it gets complicated. Because depending on which part of his record you look at, you get a completely different picture of the man behind the umpire's mask. So here's how we're going to try to figure this out. We're going to start by looking at that original promise. Then we'll dive into 3 competing portraits that have emerged since he took the bench: Roberts the partisan, Roberts the strategist, and Roberts the manager. And then at the end, we'll see if we can actually make sense of these conflicting views. All right, first things first, let's revisit that original promise. Because beyond that catchy umpire metaphor, what did John Roberts actually pledge to do as the head of the nation's highest court? Yeah, it wasn't just about calling balls and strikes. He said over and over again how much he respected precedent, the legal principle of stare decisis, which basically just means let the decision stand. He promised that he would follow the court's past rulings to make sure the law was stable and predictable. The whole message was about judicial humility, that a judge's personal views have no place on the bench. And that message was key to him getting confirmed. But almost as soon as he was confirmed, a very different picture began to take shape. This is a portrait that suggests the whole umpire thing was, little more than a myth. And this first portrait is built on cold, hard data, his voting record. And this is where that umpire promise really starts to crack. For a judge who swore he'd respect precedent, this number is, well, it's pretty shocking. In cases where the Supreme Court took the huge step of overturning one of its own past rulings, John Roberts has voted with the majority to do exactly that 81% of the time. That doesn't really sound like stability. That sounds a lot like actively remaking the law. And it gets even more stark when you zero in on the most contentious, ideologically split cases. In those razor-thin 5-4 decisions that overturned precedent, Roberts sided with the conservative outcome a staggering 93% of the time. Let me say that again, 14 out of 15 cases. That is not the record of a neutral umpire. It's the record of a very reliable vote for one particular side. Just look at his voting alignment in those nail-biter decisions. He sides with fellow conservatives like Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Alito almost 90% of the time. But how often does he join a liberal justice like Kagan in those same cases? Barely 10%. The data here paints a really clear picture. He's not some swing vote hanging out in the middle. He's a core member of the court's conservative bloc. And we're not talking about minor cases here. His vote was absolutely decisive in these landmark decisions that have reshaped American life, guiding key parts of the Voting Rights Act, opening the floodgates to corporate money in elections, and, of course, ending affirmative action in college admissions. From this point of view, the umpire is clearly playing for the conservative team. But just looking at the numbers doesn't tell the whole story. And that brings us to our second portrait, Roberts the strategist. This view suggests he's more than just a predictable conservative vote. He's a really shrewd operator who carefully chooses how and, more importantly, when to advance his legal goals. Okay, so to really get this next part, we need to know a key term, originalism. It's a philosophy, it's really popular with conservatives, and it basically says that judges should interpret the Constitution the way the founders understood it way back in the 1700s. It's a way to argue that your decisions aren't based on your own personal feelings, but on historical fact. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. A textual analysis of Roberts' written opinions found this fascinating pattern. In most of the everyday, run-of-the-mill cases, he barely even mentions originalist arguments. But in that handful of high-profile, blockbuster cases, the ones that grab all the headlines, his use of originalist language just skyrockets. It really looks like he deploys the philosophy strategically, calling on the authority of the founders precisely when a decision is most controversial and might need a little extra political cover. Okay, so now for a portrait that seems to completely contradict everything we've seen so far. This one paints Roberts as a masterful manager, an institutionalist whose number one concern isn't ideology, but the long-term health and legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. If Roberts is such a hardcore partisan, how on earth do you explain this? Under his leadership, the court has hit a 42% unanimity rate. That's the highest of any Chief Justice in the modern era. He seems to be actively working behind the scenes to find common ground and avoid those 5-4 splits whenever he can. And that's the mark of a consensus builder, not a rigid ideologue. In fact, one analysis actually created a composite score for modern Chief Justices based on how well they build consensus, control outcomes, and lead the court. And who's sitting at the very top of that list? John Roberts. This portrait suggests his main goal is just to steer the ship, to keep the court from looking like just another political branch by getting everyone to agree as much as possible. So how in the world do we reconcile these portraits? We've got the committed partisan, the calculating strategist, and the consensus-building manager. How can all of these things exist in one person? This right here, this is the central paradox of John Roberts in a single slide. His voting record in the really divisive cases is one of the most conservative on the court, but at the exact same time, he's in charge of a court that agrees unanimously more often than it has in decades. I mean, those two facts seem almost impossible to square. And maybe the single best way to understand this paradox is to look at the one vote where all three of these versions of John Roberts, the partisan, the strategist, and the manager, collided in a pretty spectacular fashion. According to sources inside the court, the story of the 2012 Affordable Care Act decision was just pure drama. Roberts initially voted with the 4 other conservatives to strike the whole thing down. But over the next 6 weeks, as public pressure was mounting, he changed his mind. He then single-handedly came up with this novel legal argument, calling the law's penalty a tax, to save it. His conservative colleagues were reportedly so furious that they mounted what one source called a desperate campaign to win him back. When that failed, they took the highly unusual step of writing a joint dissent that basically refused to even engage with his logic. So what happened? Well, you could say all 3 Robertses showed up to the party. The partisan initially voted his conservative principles. The strategist, seeing the massive political firestorm that would hit if the court struck down a president's signature law, started looking for an off-ramp. And finally, the manager, word sick about the court's reputation and legitimacy, made the final call to steer the whole institution away from a political cliff, even if it meant totally alienating his closest allies on the court. In the end, maybe that umpire metaphor was just wrong from the start. John Roberts isn't just calling balls and strikes. He's managing the entire game. He's a deeply conservative partisan who uses strategy and consensus to move the law in his direction. But it seems like his ultimate priority is making sure the game itself, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, survives. So the real question for his legacy isn't whether he was a partisan or a manager, but whether his attempts to be both at the same time were enough to save the very institution he leads.